Is this on? All right. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
I probably already did. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Glennda Testone, and I am the chair of GLAAD at Congregation Bates in Florida. We host topical, social, and cultural events focusing on LGBTQ people in their 20s and 30s. And tonight, we are honored to welcome former and current executive directors of the Center, Richard Burns and Glennda Testone, for a conversation on the LGBTQ Community Centers movement. This is the third event in our Architects of the LGBTQ Movement discussion series. Our first topic was Art as Activism with Gilbert Baker, the creator of the Rainbow Flag, and we enjoyed a wonderful tour highlighting the carefully preserved murals and installations around the center. Our second topic was Diversity, Race, Gender, and Civil Disobedience with GLAAD and our own Rabbi Sharon Kleinbaum. Both videos are available through our website if you're interested. Throughout this incredible series, we listen as our heroes, trailblazers, and advocates recount the genesis of the modern movement, and also deliver a challenge for us to envision what LGBTQ identity and activism will mean in the future. Aleinu in Hebrew means it's up to us, and so we take on that challenge as the next generation of activists finding our place in this movement. Tonight, our topic is the LGBTQ Community Centers movement. State, city, and federal advocacy. It is of course important to note that the New York LGBT Center has a parallel history with CBST. Irving Cooperberg, a CBST member, helped found the center and purchased the building we are currently in and served as its first board president. Our members have long been active in both institutions, and we continue to support each other's growth and success. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our speakers, Richard Burns and Glennda Testone. Richard Burns served as the executive director of the LGBT Center for 22 years, from December 1986 to June 2009. Through his tenure, he led the center through the AIDS epidemic, surges in activism, and cultural wins and losses. He got his activist start at Gay Community News in Boston, where he first volunteered and then worked as managing editor and later served as president of the board of directors. He attended Northeastern Law School with many gay rights activists, including our last speaker, Urvashi Bad. In 1978, Burns was the founding president of GLAAD, Gay and Lesbian Advocates and Defenders in Boston, and in 1994, he co-founded CenterLink, the national voice for nearly 150 LGBT community centers across the country. Glennda Testone joined the center as its first female executive director in 2009. Since then, she has strengthened the center's programs for adults, youth, and families, and spearheaded the launch of innovative and groundbreaking programming for LGBT youth, transgender community members, and LBT women. Testone recently helped introduce a new center brand and website, and completed a $9.2 million Capitol building renovation to transform the center's home right here. Testone came to the center from the Women's Media Center, where she served as the vice president for 3 years, and prior to her work there, served as senior director of media programs for the National Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, the other GLAAD. Both our speakers are incredible activists who have dedicated their lives to our community. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Richard Burns and Glennda Testone.
Thank you. I'm Richard. This is Glennda.
Hello.
And so we're going to interview each other. And I guess, and I should say we first met when I was at the center and Glennda was at GLAAD.
Yes.
And now we have breakfast together about every 3 or 4 months. And we sort of say, those crazy executive directors, how do they do it?
Correct. That is true. And the first time we met was actually right after 9/11. The center had an LGBT gathering for folks that were impacted by the tragedy. And I was at GLAAD at the time and sort of came as a media representative and community member to help manage things. And I can remember being really grateful that the center was here for a meeting, as a meeting place for the entire community. And really excited. We've never done anything like this. So this is also the first time that we're sort of up here together. And you know, we do talk fairly often, but it's really nice and interesting for both of us, I think, to be up here together talking to you all, and how fitting to do it for CBST, which just has such a long and wonderful history of intertwinement with the center. So, and we also hope, I think we're going to ask each other questions, but we also hope that you'll all ask us questions as well. Why don't I start and ask you a question? Does that sound right?
Yes, but first,
But
I have
first,
to make sure that I printed out your questions, and here they are.
we planned this. We're totally prepared. Ready to go. Excellent. So, Richard. This is totally spontaneous. How did New York's LGBT Center and LGBT centers in general get started?
Well, soon after Stonewall, after the Stonewall riots, there was the Gay Activist Alliance Firehouse in New York, which was not literally a community center, but I think it was sort of a seed for what LGBT community centers would be. The firehouse was a place where there were dances, and I've just heard stories. I didn't live in New York then. And the actual first centers were founded in 1973. The first three were founded in Los Angeles, in Berkeley, California, and in Albany, New York. And those centers are all still around and all own their homes, and are thriving. And today, there are well over 100, probably 150 to 180 LGBT centers that belong to Center like the National Association of LGBT Centers. But this center came to pass. This building was built in the early 1840s by something called the Public School Society, before there was the New York City public school system. And then I think it was in the late 1840s that the school system started, and this building was integrated into the school system. And it went through many incarnations, and its last life as a school was as the Food and Maritime Trade High School. It was a technical trades high school for tailors and cooks. And then it closed, and it was empty, and then the city rented it out to a bunch of tenants like Media Network and the Coalition for the Homeless, but most of the building was empty, and there were parts of it that were not even wired for electricity anymore. Rooms like this and over there, full of asbestos and pigeons roosting everywhere. And Ed Koch was mayor, and he wanted to perhaps auction it off to a developer. Maybe it could be condos, something like that. And a group of activists were really leaders in the community were getting together about the fact that New York didn't have a center, and other cities did have centers. And there was a guy named Tom Burroughs, who's still around here in New York, gay lawyer, who at that time was on the staff of the city council president, Andrew Stein. And this was before the city had a public advocate. We had a city council president who was not elected by the city council. He was elected in a citywide election, like the mayor. So you had the mayor, then you had the city council president. And Tom Burroughs said, well, there's this building on 13th Street that the city owns. Why don't we get it as a gay center? And people thought, well, that'd be wonderful. They could sell it to us for $1. It would be great. And well, of course, the city won't sell anybody anything for $1. And Ed Koch did not want to sell it to the gay community at a discount or at any price. But in those days, real estate transactions in New York, this is more than you want to know, but I find it fascinating. The governing body that determined what happened to real estate in New York was called the Board of Estimate. And each borough president, 5 boroughs, they each had a vote on the Board of Estimate. The mayor had 2 votes, the city council president had 2 votes, and the comptroller had 2 votes. So that's 11 votes. And if you could organize a bunch of borough presidents against the mayor, you could win on a real estate decision. And so that's exactly what gay community activists did. And Koch then said, well, yes, what a delightful idea. We will sell this building to what was then we called the lesbian and gay community. And, but the deal was, I'll do it if you agree to pay real estate taxes. Because, all nonprofits that own real estate
don't pay real estate taxes. And in 1983, the real estate taxes on this building were $80,000 a year. Well, it was going to be an experiment where Koch was going to see if he could get more and more nonprofits to pay real estate taxes as a revenue source for the city. So that was the deal that was cut. The deal was cut at the end of '83. This organization was formally incorporated in July of '83. They cut the deal later in '83, and then they closed on the sale of the building in December of 1984. And so that's when the center suddenly owned this space. And there was Robert Woodworth, who was still here on staff, was hired to be the manager. And there was a woman named Lou Avanzado, a lesbian, who was on the city payroll when they owned this building and then transferred over to the center. And she was in charge of not only the whole building, which was maintenance, but of shoveling the coal furnace. And it burned in the winter about a ton of coal a day. And there were no scrubbers up on that chimney. It just burned and out it went. As was true for many, many public schools in New York City at that time. So that's how the center got going. And who were these activists? Well, the founding board of the center was made up of people like Ginny Apuzzo, who had been the executive director of the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, Peter Vogel from Lambda Independent Democrats, Ken Dawson from SAGE, Karen, the minister at MCC Church, Irving Kuperberg from CBST. And so it was really a community effort of the different leading organizations in the city that came together and said, we want a center. And then after they closed the deal, that board all left the board because they had their own organizations to work on. And they couldn't fundraise and make this place happen, except for Irving, who stayed on as the president. And they recruited a whole new board of directors that actually in those days did things like if the hallway needed painting, they painted the hallway. And ran things, and Robert Woodworth organized the building, and groups began to meet here. That was what happened in the early days, is small little groups began to meet here, and the center would publicize their meetings. And so in the first few years of the center's life, the number of queer organizations in New York City multiplied dramatically, because suddenly there was a venue where people could come together. It used to be $1 a head. So if you had 10 people in a meeting, the rent was $10. And if you had 50 people in a meeting, the rent was $100. And I was a lawyer in Boston, and I was recruited down to be the center's executive director in December of 1986. And the first thing I did was double the rent from $1 to $2. So I was not a popular guy. But what prompted that, was there was this mortgage. You know, the building had been purchased for $1.5 million. At an interest rate of 18%. The mortgage payments were $18,000 a month for the first year of ownership in 1985. No mortgage payments were due. The interest just was added on to the mortgage principal. So it got bigger. And then and that was true for all of 85, most of 86, and in December of 86, the mortgage payments were supposed to start happening, but there was no plan, and there was no money. And so by the spring of 87, the city sent us a foreclosure notice. And so what we did is a board member took the foreclosure notice and blew it up into a huge poster. And the board had a retreat in the Pines, and hung this poster up, so this foreclosure notice hung over the board for the whole weekend as this sword of Damocles over the head, and the board came up with a fundraising plan. And in the spring of 1987, Ginny Apuzzo, who had left the board but was now working for Governor Mario Cuomo, talked him into coming to the center to make his first address to the queer community during his entire time as governor. And so he spoke up here in the first floor of the auditorium about HIV insurance and state regulation, some insurance policies that were beneficial to people with AIDS that he was introducing. And that was news. That was in the New York Times. And so we used that opportunity to pull in people of financial means into the center. We did a little like cocktail advance thing with Cuomo, before his public speech. And we used that as an opportunity to start a major donor program. And Vivian Shapiro, who had been the co-chair of the board of HRC, the Human Rights Campaign Fund, HRCF, who lived here in New York, she did the pitch. And she said to the people assembled, the Astors didn't need that library. Carnegie didn't need that library. They gave the money to build and buy that library for the whole city. And that's what we're going to do today in this forum. We are going to pledge $1,200 a year, $100 a month, and we are going to collectively pay the mortgage and buy this building for our people. And she gave this very impassioned pitch. She's a phenomenal fundraiser. And of course she said, here's my check, Richard. And then there were some plants in the room who stepped forward with their checks. And then people, the momentum started, and the Founders Society, which is what we call this donor club, was born. And the money came in, it was put in a special bank account that went to paying the mortgage. And then at the same time, we worked politically with activists and political people to renegotiate the interest rate with the city and to get rid of the real estate taxes, which we had not been paying. And so they were agreeing. And so that required another board of estimate over Koch's objections, and they did away with the mortgage payments. And this was a very long answer, but I'm going to wrap it up.
I love it.
And I mean, the early center programs like Second Tuesdays, the dances, they were run by center board members. And there was a group, a name you'll recognize, there was the Women's Coffee House, which was in this wing, and which was a women-only space, and ultimately became a Women and Friends space. But it was a Sunday afternoon like Women's Coffee House, and one of the organizers was Edie Whitson, who was a volunteer at the center. And that's it. I'm going to stop with that and ask Glennda a question, because I could go on a long time.
Also a member of CBST.
So Glennda,
Yes,
from your perch here at the center, where you're the executive director, what do you think the biggest challenges facing our community are today, and what have been some of our biggest victories?
Well, see, this is so, first of all, thank you for that, because there were some things I hadn't heard before. I didn't know the center had been served a foreclosure notice, and I thought to myself, being executive director now, my God, what if I got a foreclosure notice? I would be terrified. So I'm very glad once again that Richard is here for 20 plus years and built this amazing foundation that I get to now stand on and lead the center, so thank you for that. It's interesting because leading the center now, I've been at the center for 5.5 years, and people ask from time to time, so presumably and hopefully we will have marriage equality across the land in June, knock on wood. And what's next? What's left for the community to do? And I can tell you that being at the center, which is a very unique place, we still have, some things remain the same and some things change. So the major donor circle is now $1,500 annually, not $12, but we still have it. We still have the Founders Society, which is called the Hausner-Kuchenberg Legacy Society, named after Irving and Stephen. And we have a growing, thriving group of folks who are still planning for the future of our community and saying, I want to leave my money to the center because I want to support the LGBT community after I'm gone and for the next generation. But the things that have changed, I think, are that, well, what remains the same is we're in a position where we interact directly with the community every single day. So we have about 6,000 people that come to us every single week, and that number is actually growing. And we hear from people directly about what they need, what they think, what they're scared of, what they're worried about, what they're happy about, and we've been able to develop programming over time because of that. So some of the things that we hear most urgently right now, and that we're developing programming around, are the needs of the trans community. We have made some significant advances, I think, for gays and lesbians in our community. I would say we're still doing a pretty poor job around bisexual visibility and activism, and not I don't mean that in a blaming way about activists, I just mean as our community we say LGBT, but how often do we actually talk about the B or provide anything for bisexuals? And the trans community really faces tremendous challenges. So incredibly high rates of unemployment, violence, suicide, HIV, and so we've been providing trans programming through our gender identity project for about 25, 26 years now. So we were one of the first, if not, well, one of the first organizations in the city to do it. But what we see now is that the program we used to do was all around being supportive, around folks coming out around their gender identity. We had couples groups, so groups for partners of trans folks. But what we're hearing from people, we get state funding around HIV for the trans community, but what we hear from trans folks themselves is we want a life, we want to be happy, we want to have a job. And so we just found out yesterday that we actually got some private funding to launch a brand new program that's going to essentially be a trans economic empowerment program, and it's going to be around helping trans folks get jobs. Because still, we're really so excited. I mean, I can't tell you, we get funding to do testing, HIV testing and support for the trans community. And what folks say is, oh my gosh, if I get asked to take another HIV test, I mean, this literally happens everywhere I go. Can someone please help me with what I actually need? And so I'm really thrilled that we're going to be able to do that. One of the other challenges we see firsthand is that we have a tremendous amount of young people coming to us, and young people who, I used to work at GLAAD, the media GLAAD, and I would say that the visibility around our community, especially trans folks, especially youth, is really increased. I mean, you can see young folks on television coming out to their parents, having, I think about GLEAD, for example, having a really positive experience, transparent, amazing series on Amazon, and the reality is that while the visibility has increased, the services and support for these communities has not increased and still lags behind at an appallingly low level. So we've had a youth program for the last 25, 26 years, and what happens is young people come out to their families, come out in their neighborhoods, and don't have a good experience and find themselves in desperate need of support and community. And so we provide that, and it's again it's about positive youth development and making sure that young people feel good about themselves and feel supported as LGBTQ young people, but also that if they have to, if they're not going to have the support of their families and their communities, that they can build a life and be self-sustaining. And so it's about helping them get into college, get a job, and build a kind of emotional support system that's going to carry them forward. So I would say those are two of the challenges that jump to mind for us. And the victories, the day that the Supreme Court ruled on marriage, we have a very long and very wonderful relationship with Edie, and we heard about a week before that when the decision came down, she wanted to do her press conference at the center. So the morning that we heard, oh my gosh, it's happening, and the news was starting to cover it, Edie was in her apartment, and media crews have been coming to the center every day for 5 days. And so they came that morning, and they were all outside previously, and that day they came in the building. And we put them in a room downstairs on the first floor, and there was probably 50 different media outlets there. And I remember we were broadcasting C-SPAN, I think, in the third floor auditorium, and the decision came down that the Supreme Court was going to strike down a portion of DOMA, and Edie had essentially won. And there was this amazing spontaneous moment among the staff because of what it meant, but also because we all knew Edie. And it was just so wonderful to be able to see this victory for her. And then she came about 15 minutes later, because she just not that far from here. And, you know, it's amazing. People just, to this day, and I don't know if you saw this previously, people just gravitate to this place. I mean, we started out when she did her interviews in front of the 50, 60 outlets, there were maybe 100 people here. By the time she came up to the 3rd floor auditorium, the auditorium was filled with hundreds of people streaming into the hallways, just wanting to see her and celebrate for one moment with her. So I would say that's been one of our sweetest victories as a community, and how wonderful to be able to celebrate it here with the community. And I'll also say one more thing about Edie. You know, she, the Women's Coffee House, right? And she tells this wonderful story how when Theo was sick, and they were having conversations, and Theo was saying, you know, it was not an easy life being a lesbian at that time, and Theo was saying, I just wish that we had a place where we could go that wasn't a bar, you know, and it was just like a gay coffee shop. And so when we opened our coffee shop in the lobby, we named it after Edie and Thea. And Edie loved this, and she called the week after the ribbon cutting for the renovation, and she said, so I've been thinking about my coffee shop, and I wonder what you would think if I just came like once a week and just served coffee to people. Of course, on the one hand, we thought, oh my God, people would love it if Edie Windsor was serving, like what a crowd we would get if Edie Windsor was. And they were like, well, health code restriction, I guess you have to know how to serve them, so. But she has come once or twice, and you know, just unannounced, someone will go visit her and she'll say, let's go to my coffee house and get some coffee, and shows up here, and everywhere she goes, people follow her. But it's wonderful to see the history carried through in that way.
You know, another victory, really, and I should have started by congratulating you on the renovation. It's so fantastic.
Thank you.
It makes me very proud.
Well, I always say, and Richard's heard me say this, he had to do really hard renovation, because, you know, those of you who have been coming to this building for years, it was an old building. It was built in the 1840s. Some parts of it did not even have electricity. When you go to do a renovation, you open up the walls, you don't know what you're going to find. So Richard did the first renovation of this building, which was really the difficult, get the certificate of occupancy, put in air conditioning, put in the elevator, which is so important, and I got to do the, like, make it free. You really need both of us. I mean, yeah. So Richard, what do you think the key roles of centers have been in the last 40 years?
Well, really, I think the first thing people always say when folks in a community want to open a center is about a safe space. That our people deserve to have a safe space. It's not a bar. That it's a place where when you're coming out of the closet, you can walk around the block 5 times, perhaps for a week, and then come in through the door and know that you're going to be safe. A place where queer kids can come and be themselves, a place where victims of anti-gay violence can come, a place where people who are sick or who are scared can come. And so safe space is always high on the agenda, where the concept of all of us collectively taking care of our own, that becomes, that's sort of a center is, an LGBT community center is the realization, it's the physical embodiment of all of us collectively creating a space where we take care of our home. That's, I think, often the impetus. But the centers have also been a place for community celebration. You know, as Glennda was saying after the Supreme Court decision, people just came here. Well, in 1986 is when the City Council passed what's called the Gay Rights Bill, the Non-Discrimination Act. When it happened, where did people come? They came to the center. When the Supreme Court
ruled against us in the Boy Scout decision. Where did people come? They came to the center. When Matthew Shepard was killed, where did people come? They came to the center. We were in the swing space over at 1 Little West 12th Street while this was being renovated in October of 1998 when Matthew Shepard was killed. And you know, people did not want to walk over to the meatpacking district in those days because it was a meatpacking district and there was no mass transit. And people said, "Oh, I can't find it. I've never heard of West 12th Street." Well, after Matthew Shepard was killed, the building exploded. Everybody found their way over there, and there was so much demand for community organizing meeting space that we went to local gay bars and said during the early prime time hours, can we use the bar to book meetings? You know, during that absolute peak. And so after that, then it never calmed down over there. We were there for about two and a half years. It never calmed down. So in times of celebration and in times of devastation, people just automatically come here because you want to be together. You want to not only celebrate or be angry, but find a community with whom you have some connection and a public conversation about what we're going to do together. The key roles that this center has played, when you think about the organizations that were founded here under the meeting system, is in around 1985, the New York Post was doing a series of very, very homophobic and AIDS-phobic stories. And people came together to organize 2 demonstrations against the Post. They were candlelight marches. And that's how GLAAD was founded on the first floor of the center. Not soon after that, Gay Men of African Descent was founded in a corner of the first floor auditorium where people came together, black gay men came together. In 87, in the spring of 87, there's this monthly cultural program at the center called Second Tuesdays. And in those days, it was run by a board member named Diana Leo. And she would invite a different cultural figure, straight and gay, to come speak to our community on the second Tuesday of the month. And who's the writer? Just died last year.
Nora Ephron.
Nora Ephron, thank you. Nora Ephron was booked for Second Tuesdays, and she got sick, and she canceled 2 days before, and the publicity was out, the newsletter was out, and Diana thought, well, okay, I'll call Larry Kramer. And she called Larry Kramer and said, would you substitute for Nora Ephron? And he said yes. And Vivian Shapiro, the woman I mentioned earlier, had a cable television show. And so she went on a show and she said, everybody come to the center and hear Larry Kramer. And so on that Tuesday night, Larry came and the first floor auditorium was packed because he had promoted it himself and said, I'm going to make a major address. And it was a call to action and a damnation and really a call to action. And so this was a Tuesday night, and people said, well, we want to come back next week. And someone ran upstairs. The main office of the center was on the 3rd floor then, and ran up to Robert Woodward and said, can we have this room next Tuesday night downstairs? And Robert said, no, it's booked. You can have Monday. And so ACT UP began to meet every Monday night at the center thereafter. And those first couple meetings, Tim Sweeney, who was then at Gay Men's Health Crisis, was the facilitator to try and get everybody on the same page, and that did not work. And so then ACT UP began to self-facilitate and was here for many, many, many years. So that's the kind of thing, when you think of how did Housing Work start? Housing Work started at the center. Immigration equality, at the center. Queer Nation, Sex Panic, Lesbian Avengers. Organizations that are still around and organizations that have come and gone, founded at the center. So that's the kind of impact that a center can have in our community as a place for people to congregate. If you've got an idea and you can go to the center and say, I want to book a room and I want you to publicize my idea in your newsletter, your e-newsletter, your social media, in your calendar. People who don't know you, they don't know one another, but they like your idea, they'll come together at that appointed hour and make something happen. And lots of these ideas just came and went, but some of them really changed the world. for the better. And so that is the kind of impact that centers can have. And the other thing to think about is all of us come out. You know, most of us are not born into a queer community, particularly in the old days. And so you have to emigrate and immigrate into an LGBT community. And a point of entry to immigrate into the LGBT community is your community center. Because you can be the only queer you know in the world. And you walk through those doors and you're going to plug into community. So it's a point of entry into identity formation for an individual and community for all of us. And that's a remarkable thing. And in 1987, in July of 87, we held the first meeting of queer community centers around the country. There was an organization called the National Lesbian and Gay Health Association, and they held their annual conference every July. And that year was in LA. And so the LA Center, which was run by a guy, the late Eric Rofitz, and the New York Center, where I was the ED, we decided, since all these people were going to come to this big health conference in LA anyway, let's save the airfare and convene a meeting of centers. And so we had a one-day meeting of centers in July of '87 at the LA Center. And all we did was sit in a big circle around a big table and talk about what you did, and gee, I'd never met you, and who knew they did that in Minneapolis, and stay in touch. And we began to have meetings twice a year at the health conference, and then when Creating Change, when GLAAD and Sue Hyde formed the Creating Change Conference, which was probably around '88, under the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force. We began to have a centers gathering at Creating Change and one at the National Lesbian and Gay Health Conference. And then in June of '94, Stonewall 25 was happening. And people from all over the country were coming to New York for Stonewall 25. And instead of the march, remember in the 70s, the march was from Stonewall up to Central Park, and there was a rally in the park. And Patti Smith would sing, and Lou Reed would sing, and and sometimes it'd be schisms, and the women would march and have their rally here, and the men would march and have their rally there. And that was probably the late 70s, that kind of thing. And then the march began to go from Central Park down to New York. Well, in '94, it was a march on the United Nations because it was the global commemoration of the Stonewall riots, Stonewall 25. And that was the year the Gay Games were in New York. And so we convened a Congress here at the center in June of '94 and invited the leadership of all the centers around the country. And the Congress was to form and found the National Association of LGBT Community Centers, which is Centerlink. And the idea of Centerlink was not just to share program ideas and best practices, but to help new centers start in cities that didn't have them. Because of course, we all drank the Kool-Aid. We thought centers are the key to gay liberation, queer liberation, organizing, and social justice. And therefore, every town needs a center, and we're going to help them have it. And so Centerlink now has a whole staff. They're based in Fort Lauderdale, and they actually do that. It's wonderful, but it was founded here during Stonewall 25. And that's, I'll pause there. I'll ask Glennda. So Glennda, are centers as critical today as they were 15 or 20 years ago? And how so? And what has changed about the community center movement since you've become executive director?
Well, this is not due to my becoming executive director, but there are no schisms in our community at all anymore. Right? Everyone loves each other, women, men, everyone. I just wanted to say that out loud, like someday it might happen. They are still so critical, and I think that's evidenced by the fact that maybe when Centerlink started, there might have been, I don't know, how many centers?
Less than 100, like 65 maybe.
Yeah, and now there are about 200 of them all over the country, outside of the country, about 8 other different countries that we know of that are members of Centerlink. It is a very strong and thriving movement, and it really, I think centers are so critical. I started my career working in national at GLAAD, the National Media Organization, and then the Women's Media Center, which was a national progressive women's organization. And I think the unique thing about centers and the unique thing about coming coming to an organization like this that has an actual building that provides direct services is that the grassroots access, you know, people know my office. People knock on the door. They walk in the front door, they knock on my door, and it just really, there's a much more direct connection to what's going on with people. We still rent space to about anywhere between 300 and 400 groups every single month. When you leave this room, there's a ton going on outside in other rooms in the center. Now we do still help organizations sort of form, and we do it by way of, you know, a lot of organizations, while they're trying to get their 501c3 status, need a fiscal sponsor. So for example, the AIDS Memorial Park, which is happening literally right down the block, and Richard is on the board of still. We're a fiscal sponsor for them, so they don't have C3 status yet, but people can give them donations and still get the tax benefits. And we handle all of that administration. And ACT UP still meets here on Monday nights. So if you have not been to an ACT UP meeting, I highly recommend you check it out. It is amazing. But what I really see a function for centers right now is this is one of those rare places in the community where you really are exposed to the entire community. It's about 50% women, 50% men. That's not true. It's about 60-40. And we do specifically try to do women's programming to get more women in here. It's about 50-50 people of color and non-folks of color. People from all 5 boroughs, all over the city, tri-state area, New Jersey, Connecticut, Long Island, come to the center. And in fact, a couple of years ago when Sage had opened their space up on 27th, they were thinking that since they had the space up there, they might close the space down here. And Michael and I were, I think, sort of very heartened to see that folks didn't want to go. They were like, we don't want to go, we want to be here with everybody. We want to see the young kids. We want to see the trans folks. We want to see, you know, we want to be with the entire community. And that's one of the rare special things I think about a community center, is that it really is a place where everybody in the community can find something to plug into. A lot of organizations now are so focused and specialized, which is great because you can make a lot of headway on a specific issue. But this is one of those places, I think, to really get that broad exposure, whether it's passing someone in the hall that you might not otherwise have a conversation with. You know, you wind up in the bathroom together and you talk to each other. And I think those are the kind of things that can still happen now. What I have seen change about the community center movement is, you know, I think the movement in general, as we've gotten more visibility, as we've gotten more resources, has become somewhat professionalized in the sense that, you know, now community centers start and it's like, we need a fundraiser right away to raise some money so we can have some programs. One of the things that we're able to tap into that wasn't always so easy is government funding. You know, in the beginning, to buy this building, we couldn't get government money for that anyway, but, you know, it's literally $1,000 at a time from individual folks. Now it's, well, what's the CDC doing? And could we get a grant from the Department of Justice or the Department of Labor? And that's great because it provides a different scale of funding for the work that centers are able to do. But it is interesting, being one of the oldest and the second largest center in that network, we're very generous about take what you want, you know, borrow from us, don't reinvent the wheel. So there are many centers across the country, for example, that have Second Tuesdays, because we had Second Tuesdays, and we still have Second Tuesdays. And it's just a way to kind of take what was built in that network and use it in different places depending on what the community demands. So I'm going to ask Richard a question, which is, you know, one of the things I think we've done some polling on, well, what do all the centers have, and one of the things that most centers, almost every single one, have is some kind of HIV and AIDS programming. So how did the AIDS crisis really fit into the LGBT center movement and into centers in general?
Well, you know, I always, for those of you who are around, you know, I always think of like 1982 to 96 as the dying years. Those were the years when this third floor auditorium would have memorial services all the time. I remember when suddenly it tipped towards wedding receptions. This is before marriage equality, but that was like a wonderful moment when we had more wedding receptions than memorial services. And so AIDS was really, you know, it was the dominant part of our lives, and the way that, you know, for younger people, the only way I can describe it is as we were in a war, and there was a lot of devastation and chaos, lots of individual and collective pain. We used to, we would talk about people as part of the walking wounded, because all of us were suffering from multiple loss, and there were demonstrations, there was ACT UP, lots of gay rage, but so much sadness, and at the same time, that terrible devastation and crisis brought out many wonderful things in ourselves, and so, for example, that really is when the lesbian movement and the gay male movement really came together and thoroughly integrated. Lesbians were just totally there, 1,000%, for gay men who were both sick and dying, and as friends and as queer family, but then also as activists demanding change. So that was something that was going on at the time in centers, because while Gay Men's Health Crisis had been founded, I guess, in '82 in Larry Kramer's living room, and other organizations like Bailey House and other AIDS organizations in New York were being founded, the center was where people came together to organize new organizations like Body Positive, to receive services like the Callan Lord Community Health Center was then called the Community Health Project, and that was here at the center from the day the center opened on the second floor. And so if you needed an HIV test, if you needed to see a doctor, came to the center. And that kind of experience was replicated across the country at different centers. And so suddenly, more people gave money to support our movement because they wanted all of us to fight the AIDS battle together. And they did that specifically, they gave money specifically to AIDS organizations, but also to organizations like the center to help build an AIDS support infrastructure. There were lots of support groups here, coming out groups, HIV support groups. And then as government dollars, as we would pressure and organize government, the city and the state would come up with dollars that we would then use for HIV prevention. And so some of that would be targeted to young people, some would be targeted later to adults and to men of color. And then, you know, there was a moment in time where the government wouldn't say gay anymore, they said MSM, men who have sex with men. It began to be the label for funding for AIDS prevention. And so a side effect of all of this that I think we don't talk about very much is the infusion of government AIDS dollars began to help underwrite the development of the LGBT community infrastructure. Because if every center and every clinic had some HIV prevention dollars or other kinds of HIV dollars, then that would help underwrite the cost of the rent or the mortgage and help underwrite the cost of staffing. And while we all know that you lose money on every government contract, I mean, you know, because it's more expensive to provide a unit of service in New York than the government is going to pay you, but that money was critical to then building our community's infrastructure. And it's someday when people write the histories, they're gonna see that. It's gonna be more obvious when looking back in hindsight than it is to us today that
the infrastructure in our community, and community centers are a part of that infrastructure, exploded during the crisis. I think the other part of the AIDS crisis that interplayed with centers was around a flourishing of queer AIDS culture. Writing, artwork, photography, poetry. There was so much loss, but our community is so filled with fantastically talented people. And the conjunction of that loss and pain and living in this war and that talent and pressure really created a flowering of queer AIDS cultural, I don't want to say celebration, but commemoration. And there was a component of celebration in it as we celebrated the lives of those we lost and mourned, and also celebrated all of us for being so strong and fighting back and demanding change. If you go down to the New Whitney Museum, which is just down the block, there on the 5th floor in the contemporary art section, there's a lot of like the AIDS art that was made for ACT UP here. In '89, the center show, there is a one of the front west staircases is a piece of artwork on a wall by an artist who's died of AIDS named Mark Wong, and it's a brick phallus, and it's it's like as big as I am, and it's there, and that was part of the '89 center show. Well, you go over to the New Whitney, huge Mark Wong piece there, and that all was, and then he died of AIDS, and that was, as did many of the artists like Keith Haring or Arch Connolly, who had pieces in the center show. They participated in the AIDS movement. They were artists who were gay, and that was something that was happening in AIDS, in our community, in centers, in those dying years. So I'll ask you a question. Glennda, what are some of the ways we can continue to connect different generations of LGBT community members and activists?
Well, this is one of the things that excited me the most about this conversation, was the chance to do this with Richard, because I think even just being up here in the 45 minutes we've been up here, I've learned things that I didn't know. Like, who knew that Larry Kramer gave this famous speech because Nora Ephron was sick? I had no idea. That's so I just think it's so critical that we continue to talk to each other, and it's amazing to me when I go down to the youth program and talk to young queer kids about AIDS, about our community activism in Stonewall, and even it really runs the gamut. Gloria Steinem, like, who's Gloria Steinem? And ACT UP, they're like, what's ACT UP? And so I think it's up to us to really have these conversations and make sure that this awareness is happening. Because once again, HIV prevention for our community right now is completely focused on making sure folks who are positive are in treatment, viral loads are low, and they're not transmitting the disease. It is not about talking to the broader community about the disease. And so when it comes to LGBT youth, it's really up to us to make sure that we're having these conversations. And we did a screening, I think it was 2 years ago when How to Survive a Plague came out. And we did a screening in 101, which is the room where ACT UP was founded and still often meets depending on scheduling. And it was open to the public, and we brought people from the youth program. And they were, in some ways, the most engaged and the most fired up, that like, oh my God, this happened, and thank God for folks back then, and how do we get involved, and where is this happening now? And we had a panel afterwards, and Peter Staley was on the panel, and they got to talk to folks about what it was like. And I still hear young people in the halls talking about that night, and and what it was like for them to see that film and to experience that and to hear directly from someone who was there. So I just feel like one of the wonderful things about centers and one of the wonderful things about gathering places and organizations like CBSD and like us is that we get to have these conversations and we get to raise these issues and really learn from each other so that we can move forward together and we don't repeat our mistakes. So I think that centers are an ideal place to have these conversations, whether it's through art and culture or through activism or through conversations like we're having tonight. I think we have a question.
Well, it's not so much a question, but Steven Spielberg has his Shoah project where they record the stories of people before they're all gone from the Second World War. Is it possible that the center could do that with the leadership of the LGBT community because Apuzo is still alive and obviously Richard is still alive?
Yes, he is. Look at him. He's here. No, I'm really glad you asked that question, actually, because we're doing something. How many people have heard of StoryCorps?
Oh, yeah.
So they're doing, they have an LGBT sort of channel now of StoryCorps, and they're
CBSD did one.
Oh, you did one.
Yeah.
Wonderful. So they're partnering with the center, and they're really trying to get a lot of different stories from the LGBT community, and they're coming, I think it's starting in July, and they're going to be doing it about, I think they're going to start once every 2 weeks and then hoping to do once a week to record a bunch of stories. People ask me all the time, you know, is there, what about an oral history project around HIV and AIDS? And there is an ACT UP oral history project, which is a slice of AIDS activism. But to my knowledge, there is not sort of an HIV and AIDS national, you know, broad oral history project. And so I think these stories do need to be captured, which is why this is great, and we should do more. Do more, yeah. Yeah, shut up.
I think you guys are great. I really do. I love the center. But you know, one of the things I like about the center, in the past, they had a lot of openly gay celebrities. Like Richard Chamberlain, Shirley Jones. That was really exciting. I also loved one of the election days, or several of them. That was really great. Being with other gay people.
Yeah.
Of course, they're losing, but I'm glad you mentioned community health policy. That's very good. It was in this building way back then, in 1986. When I got documents here. And that was, you know, it was a very rough time for me because well, anyway, I couldn't tell anybody, but at least I had this place to go to. And because I did go there, because I couldn't go to regular place, and those days, 45, it basically saved my life. So I made it through all that. It really was great. But I just want to say one side thing, a comment. It's a third play. I was at World Club in London in 2012. It's GLAAD, Gay Lesbian Association of Doctors and Dentists.
I didn't even know there was a third one. Who knew?
That's great.
Anyway, that's I'm sure. But I have a question. One question is, well, what's our relationship with the other gay communities in the boroughs? And there's so many now, they're all over the place, they're proliferation. We have a relationship with them, and a good one, yes.
Yeah.
Okay. The other thing I wanted to mention, I remember the day in the springtime, maybe it was 85 or something, when they had the grand opening of the center, and it was exciting, the women's bathroom had all these mirror things, and the kids. I think it was like this exciting weekend or something, this opening of the center. When was that, 85 or something?
You know, I'm wondering if you're thinking about the opening of the center show on June 1st of 1989.
No, this was the opening of the center, before the center ever opened.
No, that was before my time.
Oh, oh my God.
I forget who it was before.
There was something more 20th century.
No, there was a big weekend thing. Was it the first garden party or something?
No, it wasn't
there
a garden
weekend
party,
thing?
it was just an open
No, but
house.
there was a big weekend. Yeah, it was a whole weekend.
Anyway, but this is a 20th century question. Forget about the story. What about a book? Did anyone read a book about the history of art? Not the movement, but our movement. You know, all these plays, it's very exciting. Irving, this,
No,
that,
and
this,
you know,
it's got the
if any funders are watching this video,
Yeah.
this would be a great project.
Great.
Source number one.
Story.
Yeah, yeah. I actually, since this is a CBST panel, I'd love to tell a quick CBST
Please.
story. So, again, this is before my time, but Irving Cooperberg used to tell me this story often. In late 1984, our community leaders had been negotiating with the city about trying to close the deal on the purchase of this building. And the city suddenly, after delaying, said, yes, but we've got to close in 2 weeks. Or no, not we have to close, you have to put the down payment down and then close. And the down payment was $200,000. And of course, the center had no money at all. And so Irving and the board came up with the idea that they would ask 200 people for $1,000 each, and it would be a loan. And so they wrote, they sent out like mimeographed letters and did phone calls to people. And of course, Irving was president of the synagogue and was president of the center. And Irving was an excellent fundraiser. And so a very large percentage of the original down payment donors were from the synagogue, because that's who Irving knew and had a fundraising relationship with. And after a year, the center sent letters out and said, would you be willing to forgive the loan and convert it into a donation? Or do you want to still hold it on the books as a loan, a non-interest-bearing loan? And they did that every year, and within about 2 or 3 years, almost everyone had converted their $1,000 gift into the $1,000 loan into a gift. And very, very few people then, actually said, gee, I really need you to pay it back. So they said it did. But I just say this because the congregation of CBST was really a big part of the folks who provided the original down payment and made the purchase of the building for our community possible.
The very first welcome call that I got at my desk on my first day was from Rabbi Kleinbaum saying, welcome to the center. This is probably before I started even, because the women's event that year happened before I even officially had my first day. We were honoring Rabbi Kleinbaum. And she was just so warm. Welcome to the family. We're very connected. The center at CBST, so I learned that very early on. And in fact, Edie tells a lovely story about when the center had sent her back her $1,000 check, and she opened the envelope, and on the check it said "Gay Center," and she wasn't out at that time, so she ripped it up and forgave the loan, because she thought, I don't want to go cash this at my bank, because then people are going to know I'm gay. Why do I have a check from the Gay Center? But I have a...
Irving was a very smart fellow.
Yeah. Well, I have to ask you, I always heard that story about Irving, that he was such a good fundraiser, he was raising this money in this 2-week period, and I heard that in the Pines, he would be walking, down the boardwalk, and people were so used to him asking for money, they would see him coming and jump up into the bushes, which I always love that image, and I wonder if it's true.
It's slightly apocryphal, but probably close.
Yeah. I picture people jumping, oh no, he's going to ask me for money again.
So I think are we at time? We should probably wrap up. And thank you so much. This has been great. Oh, I'm sorry.
I just have a quick question. When you said that there were 3 centers in the beginning, and one of them was in Albany?
Albany, New York.
I was really
That's how big it
shocked
is.
about that. Like, what was going on in Albany that had a center? Before New York?
That's a good question.
Just the power of local activism. It's like politics are local, and the center in Albany now, their executive director is a woman named Curtis Street, and they have lots of programs, and they own a building. It's like a big old
One of the
house.
original.
Yeah.
It's hard for me I'm from Syracuse originally, and Albany, Syracuse, Rochester, they're all very similar. I'm like, really, before New York City? But it's true, and I guess it's the capital, and the government is there, and dysfunctional vote maybe, and so that
Thank you for having us.
Yeah.
Thank you to Richard and Glenda and all of you for your great questions and for coming. Information about the upcoming events in the series will be announced soon, and we hope that you will continue to join us as the series unfolds. And for information on ALENU or CPST, please come to me. I'm happy to answer any questions. And feel free to enjoy the refreshments in the back. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.